"Do not spill a single drop," her aunt had said, not looking at her, not really, just adjusting the diamond clasp at her own throat as though Clara were part of the furniture, something placed, something useful, something that should not be noticed, and Clara had nodded because that was what she did. She nodded, she moved, she carried, and now she stood at the far edge of the grand ballroom of Whitmore House, with a silver tray balanced carefully in both hands, the weight steady, the glasses aligned, the pale gold wine catching the light from above, and the room itself felt too bright to belong to her, too large, too polished, every surface reflecting something that was not meant to include her, chandeliers stretching nearly 12 feet overhead, each crystal trembling with soft light, each flicker echoing across marble floors so clean they seemed almost liquid, and the guests moved like they had practiced it, like they had been born into it, silk skirts brushing in controlled arcs, gloved hands lifting, lowering, pausing at exactly the right moment, laughter measured, voices soft but precise, nothing wasted, nothing accidental, and Clara moved through it all without leaving a mark, stepping carefully between them, her shoes worn thin enough that she could feel the cold of the marble through the soles, her dress plain ivory, sleeves slightly too short at the wrist, a faint crease near the hem where she had mended it herself that morning before sunrise, and she kept her gaze lowered because looking too long at anything in this room would be a mistake, would suggest a kind of belonging she did not have. And yet she noticed everything, the way one woman tilted her chin just slightly higher than the others, the way another adjusted her fan not because she was warm, but because she was waiting to be seen, the way a young lord near the center of the room laughed a fraction too loudly at a remark that had not been particularly amusing, and all of it existed in a careful balance, a structure that held as long as everyone stayed where they were meant to stay, and Clara knew exactly where she was meant to stay, at the edges, near the pillars, near the doors, where she could move without interrupting the flow, where she could refill a glass before it was empty and step away before anyone had to acknowledge her. And for a while, everything followed that quiet rhythm, the music rising and falling, the conversations weaving in and out, the soft clink of glass against glass, until the moment it didn't, until something shifted in a way so subtle that no one could name it, and yet everyone felt it. Because the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a smooth, deliberate motion that carried its own kind of authority, and the music did not stop, not entirely, but it faltered, just slightly, just enough that the space between one note and the next stretched longer than it should have, and Clara, who had been turning to her left to offer a glass to a woman in pale blue, felt it before she saw him, felt it in the way the air seemed to draw inward, as though the room itself were holding its breath, and then she looked just for a moment, just enough to confirm what everyone already knew. Duke Alexander Whitmore had entered the room, and he did not pause at the threshold, did not announce himself, did not wait to be acknowledged. He stepped forward with a measured pace, removing his gloves one finger at a time, the leather folding neatly into his palm, his expression composed in a way that was not cold exactly, but controlled, precise, as though every movement had been considered and approved before it happened, and he did not look at the line of carefully positioned daughters waiting near the center of the room, did not glance at the clusters of nobles who shifted subtly to face him. He simply walked, and the room adjusted around him, conversations softening, laughter fading, bodies turning without appearing to turn, and Clara lowered her gaze again, because whatever had just entered this room was not meant for her to witness, and yet her hands tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, not from fear, not exactly, something quieter than that, something that felt like the moment before a glass slips, the instant when balance is still possible but no longer certain, and she took a step backward to avoid crossing the path of a passing couple, her heel catching just slightly against the seam of the marble, and the tray tilted, just a fraction, just enough for one glass to shift, the surface of the wine trembling, rising toward the rim, and for a single suspended second, everything slowed, the light catching the edge of the liquid, the movement of the room blurring into stillness. Clara's. Breath stopping in her throat as her fingers adjusted, correcting, steadying, the glass settling back into place before a single drop could fall, and no one saw it, no one reacted. The music continued, the conversations resumed, the structure held, and she exhaled quietly, almost without sound, lowering the tray back into perfect alignment, and she told herself it was nothing, that it had passed, that she was still where she belonged. Invisible, unnoticed, exactly as she was meant to be, and then, without knowing why, she felt it again. That shift, that pull, and this time it did not come from the room. It came from somewhere closer, sharper, and when she looked up, just slightly, just enough to see past the rim of the tray, she realized that he had stopped, not in front of the women who had been prepared for him, not at the center where all attention was meant to gather, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere no one had planned for. And though his body remained angled forward as though he had simply paused mid-step, his gaze had changed direction, not fully, not obviously, but enough. Enough that it no longer followed the expected path. Enough that it crossed the carefully maintained boundaries of the room and settled, unmistakably, on her. No one spoke. Not at first. But something moved through the room all the same, subtle and precise, like a ripple traveling beneath still water. Heads turned without appearing to turn, conversations slowed without fully stopping, and Clara felt it in the way the space around her shifted, the way a woman to her left hesitated before reaching for a glass she had already decided to take, the way a gentleman nearby lowered his voice mid-sentence, as though the air itself had changed texture, and she kept her eyes down because that was what she had learned, because attention was dangerous when it did not belong to you, but the weight of it pressed against her all the same, steady, deliberate, impossible to ignore, and across the polished expanse of the ballroom floor, Duke Alexander Whitmore stood perfectly still, one glove folded neatly in his hand, the other still half on, as though he had paused in the middle of removing it and simply chosen not to continue, and it was not hesitation. It was something else, something controlled, something intentional, the kind of stillness that made other people adjust themselves without being told. And Clara tried to breathe evenly, tried to focus on the tray, on the alignment of the glasses, on the faint condensation gathering at the base of each stem, but her fingers tightened just slightly against the silver edge, not enough to be seen, not enough to be noticed. And yet she felt it, that small shift in her own body, the awareness that something had changed and could not be undone, and then he moved again. Not toward the center where the carefully arranged daughters waited with practiced smiles and perfectly measured posture, not toward the cluster of noblemen who angled themselves subtly in his direction, but forward, at a slight angle, cutting across the expected path in a way that made no announcement, and yet altered everything, and the distance between them began to close, slowly at first, then with a quiet inevitability that made it clear he had already decided where he was going long before anyone else understood it, and a young lord stepped into his path by instinct rather than intention, a half-formed gesture of greeting, already lifting his hand, and then stopping, because the Duke did not look at him, did not acknowledge him, did not slow, and the young lord's hand lowered again, almost immediately, as though he had realized something too late to name, and he stepped back, just a fraction, just enough to clear the way, and the movement repeated itself in smaller echoes, people shifting, creating space, not because they were told to, but because something in the Duke's presence made resistance feel unnecessary. And Clara remained where she was because she had nowhere else to go, because stepping away now would draw more attention than staying still. And the tray in her hands felt heavier than it had a moment ago, not because its weight had changed, but because her awareness of it had sharpened. Every detail suddenly precise, the cool metal against her palms, the slight tremor in the liquid as she adjusted her grip, and she told herself to remain steady, to become smaller, to let him pass as he would pass everything else in this room that did not concern him. And for a moment, it seemed possible that he would, that this shift, this tension, would dissolve back into the quiet rhythm of the evening. But then he stopped again, closer now, close enough that she could see the fine line of his collar, the exact way the light caught in his hair, the faint crease near his wrist, where the glove still clung to his hand, and the space between them narrowed to something that felt too deliberate to be accidental, and she lowered her gaze further, focusing on the reflection of the chandeliers in the surface of the wine, tiny fragments of light suspended in gold, and she did not look at him, not directly, but she could feel it, the direction of his attention, the way it settled, the way it did not move, and the room responded in kind. Conversations fading into something softer, the music continuing but somehow distant, as though it had been pushed to the edges of the space, and somewhere behind her, a woman let out a quiet breath she had not realized she was holding, and another shifted her fan with a movement that was too sharp to be casual, and Clara's heartbeat found a rhythm that did not belong to the music, something quicker, something tighter, and she adjusted the tray again, just enough to ensure everything remained perfectly aligned, because that was what she could control. That was what she understood. And then, without warning, the Duke's hand moved, not quickly, not abruptly, but with a precision that made the motion feel inevitable, and his fingers reached the edge of the tray, not touching, not yet, just close enough that the space between his hand and the polished silver seemed charged with something she could not name. And for a fraction of a second, everything else in the room fell away. The laughter, the music, the shifting bodies, all of it reduced to a distant blur as the moment narrowed to this single point of contact that had not yet happened, and Clara did not move, could not move. Her breath held somewhere between her chest and her throat, and the wine in the nearest glass trembled again, a faint ripple spreading across its surface, catching the light in a way that made it seem almost unreal. And then his hand withdrew, not touching, not claiming, simply returning to his side as though the gesture had been nothing at all. And yet the absence of contact felt just as deliberate as the approach, just as controlled. And he lifted his gaze slightly, not enough to draw attention from across the room, but enough that she knew, without looking directly, that his focus had shifted from the tray to her, and the difference between those two things was small in movement, but vast in meaning, and the room felt it. Even if no one could say why, even if no one could explain what had just happened, and Clara stood there, still as the marble beneath her feet, holding the tray exactly as she had been taught, exactly as she had practiced. And for the first time since she had entered the ballroom that evening, she was no longer certain that remaining invisible was something she could choose. The distance between them was no longer abstract. It had weight now, direction, intention, and every inch of polished marble that separated Clara Bennett from Duke Alexander Whitmore felt measured, chosen, as though it existed only to be crossed, and she became aware of the exact position of her feet, the slight inward turn of her left shoe, the tension in her shoulders as she held the tray steady at chest height, elbows close, wrists aligned, just as she had been taught. And yet the precision that had once made her invisible now made her feel exposed, as though every small detail had been placed under a sharper light, and he did not rush. He did not close the distance quickly. He continued with that same deliberate pace, one step, then another, each movement controlled, unhurried, as though time itself adjusted to accommodate him. And the room followed, not in obvious ways, not with grand gestures, but in the subtle shifts that mattered more, conversations thinning into silence, laughter dissolving before it could fully form, a fan lowering halfway and not rising again, and Clara could feel the eyes now, not directly on her, not yet, but circling, gathering, waiting for something to justify their attention, and she lowered her gaze further, focusing on the rim of the nearest glass, on the way the light fractured through it into pale gold lines across the tray, because looking up would confirm something she was not prepared to face. And yet she knew exactly where he was without seeing him. Knew the moment he stepped within 3 feet, then 2, the shift in air, the quiet presence that pressed against her senses without needing to announce itself. And then he stopped, close enough that she could see the edge of his shoes, polished, dark, unmoving, aligned precisely with the seam in the marble floor, and neither of them spoke. Not immediately, the silence stretching, not awkward, not uncertain, but deliberate, held in place like a breath that no one dared release, and Clara adjusted the tray again, a fraction of an inch, enough to keep the glasses from touching, enough to give her hands something to do, and the movement felt louder than it should have, sharper, as though the smallest sound had been amplified by the stillness around them, and then, slowly, he lifted his hand, not toward her face, not yet, but toward the tray, his fingers hovering over one of the glasses, pausing there, as though considering it. And for a moment, it seemed like a simple gesture, a man selecting a drink, something ordinary, something expected. And yet the way he did it made it something else entirely, because he did not take the glass. He let his fingers rest lightly against the stem, just enough to steady it, just enough to stop the faint tremor that had begun again without her realizing it. And the contact was brief, controlled, his hand withdrawing almost immediately. But the effect remained, the glass now perfectly still, the surface of the wine smooth again, reflecting the chandeliers in unbroken lines. And Clara felt the steadiness travel through the tray, into her hands, into her shoulders. A strange, quiet correction that she had not asked for and could not refuse. And then he spoke. And his voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried in that precise, controlled way that seemed to reach exactly as far as it was meant to, no further, no less. "You nearly lost it," he said, not as an accusation, not as a question, simply as an observation, and Clara's breath caught, just slightly, because the words were simple. But the fact that he had noticed at all shifted something deeper than the moment itself, and she lowered her head a fraction more, her voice careful, steady. "It will not happen again, Your Grace." And the title felt heavier than usual, more deliberate, as though saying it acknowledged something she did not fully understand, and he did not respond immediately, not with words, his silence stretching again, but different this time, less distant, more focused, and she became aware of the angle of his gaze, not dismissive, not passing over her, but fixed, attentive in a way that felt almost precise, as though he were reading something in front of him rather than simply looking, and the room reacted again, more noticeably now, a murmur beginning at the far edge, quickly suppressed, a shift in posture among the nearest guests, shoulders straightening, heads turning just enough to confirm what they thought they were seeing, and Clara felt it build, that attention she had spent years avoiding, now gathering with a weight she could not step away from, and she kept her hands steady, her posture unchanged, because any movement now would be seen, interpreted, magnified, and then, without warning, he stepped closer. Not. Enough to touch, but enough to narrow the space between them to something that felt deliberate, undeniable, and his hand lifted again, this time not toward the tray, but toward her, stopping just short of contact, 2 fingers hovering near the edge of her chin, the gesture incomplete, suspended, and everything in the room seemed to hold again, the music continuing somewhere distant, the conversations reduced to nothing, the entire ballroom narrowing to this single point of stillness, and Clara felt the instinct to step back, rise, and stop in the same instant, because there was nowhere to go that would not make this worse. And so she remained, her breath shallow, her gaze lowered, waiting for something she could not predict, and his fingers moved, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with that same precise control, touching just beneath her chin, a light, steady pressure that guided rather than demanded, and her head lifted before she could stop it, her eyes rising to meet his, and the moment locked into place, sharp, absolute, impossible to ignore, and in that instant, the structure of the room shifted, not visibly, not in any way that could be pointed to, but in something deeper, something understood without being spoken, because he had chosen to look at her, to touch her, to acknowledge her, and nothing in that ballroom was designed to allow that, and yet it had happened, and no one moved to correct it. Her eyes met his, and for a moment that stretched too long to be accidental, neither of them moved, not even the smallest adjustment, not even the flicker of a blink, and Clara felt it, not as fear, not exactly, but as something sharper, something colder. The awareness that this was no longer a passing moment, no longer something that could dissolve back into the rhythm of the evening, because he had made it visible, undeniable, and the room responded before she could. A shift that began at the edges and moved inward, a ripple of recognition that something had broken from its place. A whisper caught too late and silenced too quickly, the rustle of silk as bodies turned, not fully, but enough to see, enough to confirm, and Clara's breath stayed shallow as his fingers remained beneath her chin, not pressing, not forcing, simply holding her there with a steadiness that left no room for refusal, and then, slowly, he released her, his hand lowering with the same controlled precision, the contact ending without abruptness, without apology, as though it had always been meant to happen and therefore required no explanation. And yet the absence of his touch felt louder than the touch itself, a space left behind that the entire ballroom seemed to notice. And she lowered her gaze again, but it was too late. The moment had already been seen, already understood in ways that did not need words, and across the room, a woman's fan snapped shut with a sound that cut sharper than it should have, and another voice, quieter, closer, spoke just above a whisper. "That is a servant." And the words were not meant for him, not meant to challenge, but they carried anyway, slipping through the silence that had settled too thick to contain them, and Clara felt the weight of it settle over her, heavier than before, because now it was no longer invisibility that defined her place. It was visibility in the wrong way. Attention sharpened into judgment, and she kept her posture unchanged, her hands steady on the tray, because any reaction would only deepen the shift, and for a moment it seemed as though the room might correct itself, might pull back into its ordered lines, might pretend this had not happened. But then a figure stepped forward, not abruptly, not rudely, but with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the structure of the world still held Lady Harrowmont, tall, composed, her gown a deep shade of midnight blue that caught the light in controlled glimmers, her posture flawless, her expression carefully neutral, and she inclined her head just enough to acknowledge him. "Your Grace," she said, her voice smooth, measured, carrying the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being heard, "perhaps you would care to join the others." And the words were polite, perfectly so, but beneath them was something else, a correction, a gentle redirection toward what was expected, toward what was proper. And Clara felt it immediately, the attempt to restore order, to place him back within the lines that had been drawn long before this moment, and for a fraction of a second, the room seemed to wait, holding its breath not for him, but for the answer. And he did not turn to Lady Harrowmont immediately, did not release the space he occupied in front of Clara, his attention still anchored, still fixed, as though the interruption had not yet registered as something that required response, and the pause stretched, long enough to make the polite suggestion feel less certain, long enough to shift its balance from expectation to risk. And then, finally, he moved, but not in the way anyone anticipated. He did not step away, did not retreat toward the center. Instead, he reached forward, not toward the tray this time, not toward the glass, but toward Clara's wrist, his fingers closing lightly around it, just enough to establish contact, just enough to claim her attention without force. And the tray tilted, only slightly, the glasses trembling in unison as her balance shifted, and for a single suspended second, everything froze. The liquid inside each glass catching the light, the reflections of the chandeliers breaking into fractured lines. The entire room held in that precise, fragile moment before movement returned, and then she steadied it, her grip tightening, her posture correcting, the tray leveling once more, and his hand remained at her wrist, steady, deliberate, not restraining, not guiding, simply holding, and the effect was immediate, unmistakable, the room reacting not with sound, but with absence of it. Conversations falling away entirely now, the music continuing but hollow, distant, as though it no longer belonged to this space. And Lady Harrowmont's expression did not change, not visibly, but something in the angle of her. Shoulders shifted, a fraction, a recalibration, and Clara felt the eyes now, fully, directly, no longer circling, no longer waiting, but fixed, assessing, measuring, and she stood there within it, the tray in her hands, his fingers at her wrist, the distance between them reduced to something that could not be ignored. And then he spoke, his voice quiet, controlled, cutting cleanly through the silence that had gathered too thick to hold anything else. "She stays," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a certainty that did not invite argument, and the words settled into the room with a weight that shifted everything, because they were not addressed to anyone in particular, not to Lady Harrowmont, not to the assembled guests, but to the structure itself. And for a moment, no one responded, not because they did not hear, but because there was nothing in the rules they understood that accounted for this. And Clara felt the world tilt, not physically, not in any way that could be seen, but in something deeper, something that altered the ground beneath every expectation she had carried into that room. And she did not move, could not move. Her breath caught somewhere between shock and something else she could not yet name, as his hand remained where it was, steady, unyielding, and the ballroom, for all its light and music and polished perfection, had never felt so completely still. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the room with a finality that felt heavier than any raised voice, and Clara stood exactly where she had been, her wrist still held in his grasp, the faint pressure of his fingers steady and unyielding, not painful, not forceful, but absolute in its intent. And for a moment, nothing followed. No immediate objection, no sudden movement, just the kind of silence that carried awareness, that forced every person in that ballroom to decide what they had just witnessed and what it meant. And then the reaction began, not in a single motion, but in fragments. Lady Harrowmont's fan lifting again, slower this time, as though the gesture required more consideration than before. A gentleman near the back shifting his stance, one polished shoe sliding half an inch across the marble before settling again, a soft murmur rising and dying almost instantly, as though it had been cut short before it could take shape. And Clara felt it all without turning her head, without lifting her gaze, because the weight of attention had become something physical now, something that pressed against her from all sides. And still she did not move, because she could not determine which movement would make it worse. Stepping away would draw notice, remaining still already had. And so she held the tray as she had been taught, perfectly balanced, her fingers aligned along the edge, the glasses steady, though the tension in her hands had begun to creep upward into her wrists, into her shoulders. A quiet strain that built without release. And beside her, Duke Alexander Whitmore did not shift, did not release her, his posture unchanged, his attention fixed with a calm that felt almost indifferent, and yet carried a precision that made indifference impossible. And finally, someone spoke. Not from across the room this time, not hidden behind the safety of distance, but close, deliberate, Lord Penhurst, stepping forward with a measured pace, his expression composed in the way of men who believed themselves practiced in control, his gaze moving from the Duke to Clara and back again as though assessing a detail that did not belong. "Your Grace," he said, his tone respectful, careful. "I believe there has been some confusion." And the words were chosen with intent, not confrontational, not direct, but carrying the implication that something needed to be corrected. And Clara felt the shift again, the subtle realignment of attention toward this new point of tension, and the Duke did not turn fully, did not release her wrist, his head inclining only slightly in acknowledgement, enough to indicate he had heard, not enough to suggest he intended to comply, and the pause that followed stretched just long enough to make Lord Penhurst continue, compelled by the absence of response. "The staff are instructed to remain at the perimeter," he added, his hand lifting briefly, not pointing, not quite, but indicating the invisible boundary that Clara had crossed without meaning to. And for a fraction of a second, the room seemed to agree with him, the structure reasserting itself, the expectation of correction rising, and Clara felt it press against her, the familiar weight of being placed back where she belonged, and her fingers tightened around the tray just enough that the metal edge pressed into her skin, grounding her in something tangible, something she could control. And then the Duke moved, not abruptly, not with any display that could be called forceful, but with a precision that made the motion feel inevitable, his hand releasing her wrist only to shift upward, his fingers closing around the base of the tray, steadying it, holding it in place so that she no longer carried its full weight. And the change was immediate, subtle but undeniable. The balance of the object now shared, no longer hers alone, and the room reacted again. A sharper intake of breath somewhere behind them, quickly suppressed, and Lord Penhurst's expression altered by the smallest degree, a flicker that passed too quickly to name, and Clara felt it, that shift in power, not declared, not spoken, but enacted through the simplest of physical gestures, and she did not know where to look, did not know whether to focus on the tray, on his hand, on the space between them, and so she kept her gaze lowered, her posture unchanged, as though stillness might contain what was unfolding. And then the Duke spoke again, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach those who needed to hear. "Then adjust the instruction," he said, and the words were not raised, not emphasized, but they cut cleanly through the expectation that had begun to form. And for a moment, Lord Penhurst did not respond, not immediately, the pause longer this time, heavier, as though the answer he had prepared no longer fit the shape of the moment, and the ballroom held again, suspended between what was and what had just been altered, and Clara felt the weight of the tray lessen further as the Duke's grip remained steady, his hand unmoving, his presence anchoring the object in a way that made her own effort almost secondary. And the realization came quietly without announcement, that he had not simply chosen to acknowledge her. He had chosen to involve himself in her position, to step into the space that defined her role and alter it. And the difference between those two things was vast, and it spread outward through the room in ways that could not be contained, the murmurs beginning again, softer but more insistent, the careful composure of the guests tightening into something more controlled, more deliberate, as though each person were recalculating their place within a structure that had just shifted beneath them, and Clara stood at the center of it without intending to, her breath measured, her hands no longer carrying the full weight of the tray, and for the first time since the moment had begun, she felt something else beneath the tension, not relief, not yet, but a strange, quiet awareness that the ground she had always understood might no longer hold in quite the same way, and she did not know whether that was something to fear or something to follow, only that it had begun, and there was no returning it to what it had been before. The shift did not settle, it deepened, spreading outward in quiet, controlled fractures that no one dared to name aloud, and Clara could feel it in the way the air seemed to tighten around her, the way every movement in the ballroom became more deliberate, more measured, as though each person present had suddenly become aware of their own position and the risk of stepping outside it. And still the Duke's hand remained at the base of the tray, steady, unwavering, his grip light but absolute, sharing the weight without asking, without explaining, and the simplicity of the gesture made it more unsettling than anything louder would have been, because it could not be dismissed, could not be reinterpreted as accident or oversight. It was a choice, clear and visible, and the room responded accordingly. The silence now layered with something sharper, something expectant, as though waiting for the next line to be drawn, and Clara kept her posture unchanged, her shoulders aligned, her hands still placed exactly where they had been taught to rest. But the tray no longer felt like hers alone, and that difference altered everything. Her balance, her breath, the way she stood within the space that had always defined her as separate. And then the music faltered again, not stopping entirely, but shifting into a softer, slower measure that seemed to drift rather than lead. And the dancers near the center hesitated, their steps losing synchronization for a fraction of a second before correcting, the rhythm no longer quite matching the room, and that small disruption carried further than it should have, because it mirrored something deeper, something structural that had already begun to change. And Lord Penhurst stepped back, not abruptly, not with any visible concession, but with a recalibration that was clear to anyone watching closely, his hands folding neatly behind his back, as though to contain the impulse to intervene further. And Lady Harrowmont did not move at all, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but the angle of her head shifted just slightly, enough to suggest she was no longer observing from a distance, but assessing, measuring. And Clara felt that attention settle alongside the others, heavier now, more focused, and she resisted the urge to adjust her stance, to shift her weight from one foot to the other, because even that small movement would be seen, interpreted, and instead she remained still, her breath controlled, her focus narrowing to the exact placement of her fingers against the cool metal of the tray, and beside her the Duke moved again, not releasing the tray, not stepping away, but turning slightly, just enough to align his body more fully with hers rather than with the room. And the shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but its effect was immediate because it redefined the space between them, no longer incidental, no longer passing, but shared. And the ballroom reacted in silence, the awareness spreading in quiet waves, and then, without warning, he lifted one of the glasses from the tray, his fingers closing around the stem with the same controlled precision, the motion smooth, unhurried, and for a moment it appeared ordinary. A man taking a drink, something expected, something that could be folded back into the normal flow of the evening, but he did not drink, not immediately. Instead, he held the glass at a slight angle, the liquid inside catching the light, the reflection of the chandeliers breaking across its surface, and he extended it toward her, not fully, not in a gesture that could be mistaken for service, but in a way that paused between offering and intention. And Clara felt the shift before she understood it, the inversion of roles that had been fixed for as long as she could remember, and her hands did not move at first. Her body caught between instinct and uncertainty, because accepting would mean stepping into something she had no place in, and refusing would be seen as defiance she could not afford. And the moment stretched, suspended, the glass held between them, the light trembling in its surface, and then she moved, slowly, carefully, her fingers lifting from the edge of the tray, reaching for the stem, her touch precise, controlled, mirroring his without intending to, and for a fraction of a second, their hands overlapped, not grasping, not lingering, just the briefest contact as the weight transferred, and the entire room seemed to hold in that instant, the smallest point of contact expanding into something larger than itself, and then the glass was hers, steady in her hand, the tray still supported by his. The balance between them maintained, and he released it without comment, without acknowledgement, his attention never leaving her, and Clara stood there holding. Something she had not been meant to hold, Her role altered in a way that had no clear definition, and the room reacted in silence again, the tension sharpening, the boundaries that had once been invisible now stark, visible in every glance, every held breath, every restrained movement, and she felt it, the pressure building, not yet breaking, but nearing a point where it would demand resolution. And still no one spoke, no one intervened because there was no clear way to do so without stepping into something equally uncertain. And the Duke finally raised his own glass, the one he had taken earlier, bringing it to his lips with a measured motion, his gaze never shifting, and he drank. A single controlled sip, the action simple, deliberate. And when he lowered the glass again, the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was charged, waiting, as though the next moment would determine whether this shift would hold or collapse, and Clara stood at the center of it. The weight of the room pressing in, the glass in her hand steady, the tray between them still shared, and for the first time, she understood that whatever had begun here was no longer contained within a single moment. It had taken root, and it was not finished. The glass in her hand did not belong there, not in the way she held it, not in the way the light caught along its rim and reflected against her fingers. And Clara could feel that truth in every gaze that settled on her now. No longer cautious, no longer indirect, but sharp, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. And she stood with it anyway, her posture steady, her shoulders aligned, the tray still supported between her and the Duke, the balance shared in a way that had no precedent in the room, and the silence stretched, no longer fragile but tightening, pressing inward as though the space itself were narrowing around the moment. And then it broke. Not loudly, not with a raised voice, but with something more precise, more controlled. "This is highly irregular," Lady Harrowmont said, her tone calm, composed, each word placed with care, and the sound carried, cutting cleanly through the layered quiet, and Clara felt it land, felt the shift it created, the permission it gave for the tension to take shape, and the Duke did not look at her, not immediately, his attention remaining fixed where it had been, on Clara, as though the interruption existed at the edge of his awareness, rather than at its center, and that more than anything, altered the balance again, because it placed the challenge outside the axis of his focus, and Lady Harrowmont took a step forward, the movement smooth, controlled, her gown trailing behind her in a soft line that caught the light with every inch, and she stopped at a distance that was proper, measured, neither too close nor too far, and yet close enough that her presence could not be ignored, and Clara felt the air tighten further, the invisible lines of hierarchy pulling taut, and she lowered her gaze slightly, not in retreat, but in instinct, because standing within that exchange was not something she had ever been meant to do. And yet she could not step away, not with his hand still steady against the tray, not with the glass still held between her fingers, and then the Duke moved, not toward Lady Harrowmont, not away from Clara, but with a small, precise adjustment that shifted his weight, his shoulder angling just enough to place himself more fully between Clara and the rest of the room, not blocking, not shielding, but altering the line of sight in a way that changed the dynamic without declaring it. And the effect was immediate, subtle, but undeniable. And Clara felt it as a change in pressure, a redirection of attention that no longer struck her directly, but moved through him first, filtered, controlled. And Lady Harrowmont's gaze followed that shift, her expression remaining composed, but the pause that followed her statement lengthened, as though she were recalculating the angle of her approach, and then she continued. "The order of the evening has been carefully arranged," she said, her voice still even, still measured. "And it would be unfortunate to disrupt it," and the words carried more weight now, not because they were louder, but because they were supported by the structure of the room itself, by the expectations that had been built into every movement, every glance, every placement of bodies within that space. and Clara felt that structure press in, felt the familiarity of it, the certainty of where she belonged within it, and the contradiction of where she now stood, and her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of the glass. The faintest tremor passing through the liquid, catching the light again in a brief, shimmering distortion, and for a fraction of a second, everything seemed to slow, the reflection breaking, reforming, the moment suspended between correction and continuation. And then the Duke spoke, his voice quiet, controlled, cutting through the layered tension with a clarity that did not require force. "Then it should withstand a single change," he said, and the words settled into the room with a precision that left no space for misinterpretation. And Clara felt the shift ripple outward again, stronger this time, because it did not merely deflect the objection, it reframed it, and Lady Harrowmont did not respond immediately, her gaze holding steady, her posture unchanged. But something in the angle of her chin lifted, a fraction, a subtle assertion that the exchange was not yet concluded, and across the room the attention sharpened further. No longer passive, no longer observational, but engaged. Each person present drawn into the unfolding line of conflict whether they wished to be or not, and Clara stood at the center of it, her breath measured, her body still, the glass in her hand steady despite the tension that moved through her, and then, without warning, the Duke's hand shifted again, releasing the tray entirely this time, leaving its weight. Fully in her control, and the change was immediate, the balance returning to her hands alone, the familiar strain settling back into her wrists, her shoulders. But it did not feel the same, not after it had been shared, not after it had been altered, and before she could adjust, before she could recalibrate, his hand moved again, not toward the tray, not toward the glass, but toward her arm, his fingers closing lightly just above her elbow, and he guided her forward, a single step, controlled, deliberate. And the movement was small, almost nothing, and yet it shifted everything, because it moved her out of the place she had occupied, out of the edge, out of the perimeter, and into the space that had been reserved for those who belonged. And the room reacted in a sharp, collective stillness, the kind that came not from uncertainty, but from the recognition that a boundary had just been crossed in full view of everyone present, and Clara felt it as a physical sensation, the change in the floor beneath her feet, the difference in distance between herself and the nearest guests, the way the air seemed to press differently against her skin, and she stopped where he guided her, her posture holding, her hands steady, the tray balanced once more, and he released her arm as precisely as he had taken it, the contact ending without hesitation, and for a moment, nothing followed, no immediate response, no correction, just the silence, deeper now, heavier, and Clara stood within it, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen. And she understood, with a clarity that settled quietly but completely, that whatever this was, whatever he had chosen to begin, it had moved beyond a moment, beyond a gesture, into something that could not be undone by silence alone. The step he had guided her into did not settle into place. It echoed, widening outward through the ballroom in a way that could not be contained. And Clara felt it in the sudden stillness of those nearest to her, the way a lady mid-turn halted just before completing the motion, her skirt suspended in a soft arc that no longer followed the music, the way a gentleman's hand hovered inches from a partner's waist without touching, the entire room caught in that precise suspended second where movement forgot how to continue, and Clara stood at the center of it, the tray steady in her hands, the glass still held in her fingers, her breath controlled but shallow, and for the first time, she became aware not only of being seen, but of being placed, repositioned within a space that had never allowed for her presence, and the awareness carried weight, not abstract, but physical, pressing against her shoulders, tightening along her spine, and she did not know where to look, because there was no longer a direction that would allow her to disappear. And beside her, Duke Alexander Whitmore did not shift away, did not return to the expected center. He remained exactly where he had placed himself, aligned with her, his posture calm, composed, as though nothing in this moment required urgency, and that absence of urgency intensified everything, because it removed the possibility that this was accidental, that it might pass on its own, and across from them, Lady Harrowmont took another step forward, the movement precise, deliberate, her gaze steady, no longer masked by polite distance. And when she spoke again, her voice carried further, not louder but sharper, edged with something that had not been there before. "You place her where she does not belong," she said, and the words were clear, unmistakable, no longer framed as suggestion, no longer softened by courtesy. And Clara felt them land, felt the definition within them, the boundary drawn in language that matched the one drawn in space, and her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of the glass, the faintest tremor passing through the liquid once more, catching the light in a brief, fractured shimmer, and for a fraction of a second, everything narrowed to that point. The trembling surface, the reflection breaking and reforming, and then it stilled again, and she lifted her chin just slightly, not enough to challenge, not enough to draw further attention, but enough that her line of sight rose from the floor to somewhere just below his shoulder. And it was the smallest shift, almost nothing, and yet it felt like crossing something unseen, and the Duke moved in response, not away, not to intercept Lady Harrowmont's words, but with a slight turn of his head, his gaze finally shifting outward, not leaving Clara entirely, but expanding to include the room, to include the source of the challenge, and the effect was immediate, the tension redirecting, focusing, and when he spoke, his voice carried with the same controlled precision. But there was something beneath it now, not anger, not impatience, something colder, something that did not require volume to assert itself. "Then the room has been arranged too narrowly," he said. And the words did not rise. They settled, deliberate, unyielding. And the ballroom reacted not with sound, but with a tightening that moved through every person present, because the statement did not defend her, it redefined the structure around her, and that was something far more difficult to contain. And Lord Penhurst shifted again, his posture adjusting, his weight moving from one foot to the other in a controlled, practiced motion. But the timing of it betrayed something less certain beneath, and a woman near the edge lowered her fan entirely, her attention no longer disguised, and Clara felt it all, the pressure building, the expectations straining against something that refused to return to its previous shape. And then the Duke reached forward once more, his hand closing around the glass she still held, not taking it from her, not removing it, but guiding it upward, a controlled motion that brought it level with her line of sight. And for a moment, the gesture seemed unclear, suspended between meaning and action. And then he released it, leaving it in her hand at that height, and the implications settled slowly, unmistakably, and Clara understood not in words, not in logic, but in the quiet, precise way her body responded, her fingers adjusting, her wrist steadying, and she brought the glass to her lips, the movement measured, controlled, mirroring his earlier action without intending to. And for a fraction of a second, the entire room froze again, the motion suspended, the glass just touching the edge of her mouth, the light breaking across. Its surface, the reflection of the chandeliers scattering into fragments that seemed to hang in the air. And then she took a sip, small, careful, the liquid cool against her lips. And when she lowered the glass again, nothing had returned to what it had been, and the silence that followed was no longer waiting. It was charged, dense, carrying the weight of what had just been made visible, and Clara stood within it, no longer at the edge, no longer unacknowledged, her presence fixed in a way that could not be undone by turning away. And the Duke remained beside her, unmoving, his attention steady. And for the first time since this began, it became clear to everyone watching that this was not a moment that would dissolve. It was something that would continue, and no one in that room yet knew where it would end. The sip did not end the moment. It sharpened it, crystallizing something that had only been implied until now, and Clara felt it the instant the glass lowered from her lips. The shift in the room no longer subtle, no longer restrained, but fully present, pressing in from every direction, the weight of expectation, of judgment, of disbelief. And she held the glass steady, her fingers firm, despite the tremor that threatened beneath, her posture unchanged because there was no safe way to adjust now, no movement that would return her to what she had been before, and across from her, Lady Harrowmont's composure did not break, but it hardened, the softness of her expression giving way to something more defined, more exact. And when she stepped forward again, it was no longer a gesture of polite correction. It was a claim of position, her presence entering the space fully, closing the distance that had once been maintained, and the room reacted with a collective stillness that felt almost audible, the kind that comes when a line is about to be drawn in full view of everyone. And Clara's breath slowed, not by choice, but by necessity, because the air itself seemed to thicken, to resist anything too sudden, and the Duke remained where he was, unmoved, his attention no longer divided, his gaze steady, fixed, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching into something that could not hold much longer, and then Lady Harrowmont did, her voice carrying with a clarity that cut through the room without raising itself. "You elevate her," she said, and the words were precise, chosen, not emotional, not reactive, but deliberate, beyond her station, and the finality in them landed like a seal, a definition that attempted to close what had been opened, and Clara felt it. The familiar structure trying to reassert itself, to pull her back into place, to remind her of the boundary she had never crossed until now, and for a fraction of a second, the instinct to step back returned, sharp, immediate, a reflex built over years of knowing where she did and did not belong, and her heel shifted, just slightly, a half-inch against the marble, the beginning of a retreat, and everything seemed to slow again. The movement caught mid-gesture, the tray tilting just enough to threaten imbalance, the liquid in the glasses trembling, the light fracturing across their surfaces. And then the Duke's hand moved, faster than before, not abrupt, but decisive, his fingers closing around the edge of the tray, steadying it, stopping the motion before it could complete. And the contact was firm, controlled, leaving no space for uncertainty. And Clara's foot stilled, her balance corrected, the retreat halted before it could become visible, and the moment locked into place. Sharp, absolute. And the room felt it. The interruption of that instinct, the refusal to allow the movement to follow its natural course, and the power within it shifted again, not in words, not in declarations, but in the physical prevention of something expected. And he did not release the tray, not immediately, his grip remaining, anchoring it, anchoring her within the space she had been moved into, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight now, not louder, but more defined, each word placed with a precision that left no room for reinterpretation. "No," he said, and the single word cut through the structure that had been presented, not arguing, not negotiating, simply refusing, and the simplicity of it made it more final than anything longer could have been, and Clara felt it resonate. Not around her, but through her, as though the refusal had been applied to the position she had almost stepped back into, and Lady Harrowmont did not respond immediately, her gaze holding steady, but the pause that followed was no longer controlled in the same way. It carried something sharper, something that acknowledged the resistance rather than guiding it, and the room reacted in fragments, a breath drawn too sharply and released too quickly, a fan closing with a soft snap that carried further than intended, the faint scrape of a shoe against marble as someone shifted their weight without meaning to, and Clara stood within it, her hands steady again, the tray balanced, the glass still held, and she became aware of something else, something quieter. Beneath the tension, a shift not in the room, but within herself, The realization that the line she had been taught to respect had already been crossed, and that stepping back now would not restore it, would not undo what had been seen, and the Duke's hand finally released the tray. But the absence of his grip did not return her to what she had been. It left her standing in the space he had held open, and he stepped forward. Not away. Not retreating, but closing the distance between himself and Lady Harrowmont by a single controlled step, placing himself fully within the center of the exchange, and the movement was small, measured, but its effect was immediate. The axis of the room shifting to accommodate it, the attention focusing, tightening, and Clara felt it as a change in the air behind him, the space no longer pressing directly against her, but moving through him first, and Lady Harrowmont's chin lifted slightly, her posture unchanged, but the tension in the line of her shoulders now visible to anyone who knew where to look, and for a moment it seemed as though she might speak again, might press the argument further, might attempt to restore what had been disrupted. And then the Duke spoke once more, his voice calm, unwavering, carrying the authority that had been present from the beginning, but now stood unchallenged in its clarity. "She stands where I place her," he said, and the words did not rise, did not need to. They settled into the room with a weight that could not be displaced, and the effect was immediate, absolute, the tension breaking not into noise but into silence, deeper than before, heavier, final in a way that no one present could ignore, and Clara stood behind that line, within it, no longer uncertain of where she had been moved, only uncertain of what it would cost, and the ballroom, for all its light and music and carefully arranged order, had never felt so completely, irrevocably altered. The words did not settle, they restructured the room, and Clara felt it not as sound, but as a shift beneath her feet, something fundamental giving way to something else that had not existed moments before, and for a breath that did not quite complete, no one moved. Not Lady Harrowmont, not Lord Penhurst, not the cluster of carefully positioned daughters who had once occupied the center with quiet certainty, all of them held in that precise, suspended instant where expectation had been broken, and no immediate replacement had yet formed. And Clara stood within it, her hands steady around the tray, the glass still held between her fingers, and for the first time since this had begun, she felt something unfamiliar rise beneath the pressure. Not confidence, not yet, but the absence of retreat, the quiet recognition that the step she had nearly taken backward no longer existed as an option, and the Duke remained in front of her, his posture unchanged, his presence anchoring the shift he had created. And then he moved again, not away, not to conclude the moment, but to deepen it, his hand lifting toward her once more, not abrupt, not forceful, but precise, and his fingers reached the edge of the tray, pausing there for a fraction of a second, as though marking the boundary that had once defined her place. And then he removed it entirely, sliding the tray from her hands with a smooth, controlled motion, the weight leaving her palms in an instant, and the absence of it was immediate, startling. Her fingers left suspended for a breath too long before lowering, empty, and the room reacted, a subtle intake of breath that moved through the gathered guests like a ripple, because the object that had defined her role had been taken from her, and not returned, not reassigned, but removed completely. And the Duke turned slightly, extending the tray behind him without looking, and a servant stepped forward instinctively, receiving it with both hands, retreating just as quickly, the exchange seamless, efficient. And yet its meaning carried far beyond the action itself. And Clara stood there with nothing in her hands, nothing to hold, nothing to justify her presence within the structure that had always required it. And the realization settled slowly, unmistakably, that she was now standing in the center of the ballroom without function, without purpose as it had been defined for her. And before she could process it, before she could find a way to step back into something safer, the Duke's hand moved again, this time toward her shoulder, his fingers resting lightly against the fabric of her sleeve, not gripping, not forcing, but guiding. and he turned her, not sharply, not abruptly, but with a controlled pressure that repositioned her within the space, angling her body toward the center, toward the gathered guests, toward the line of daughters who had been prepared for him. And the movement was small, measured, and yet it carried a weight that made the entire room respond, the silence tightening, the attention sharpening, and Clara felt it as a shift in direction, the focus no longer surrounding her, but aligning with her, placing her within the line of sight that had once excluded her entirely. And then he stepped beside her, not in front, not blocking, but level, his presence parallel to hers in a way that redefined the space they occupied, and the contrast was immediate, unmistakable. The difference in dress, in bearing, in everything that had once separated them, now placed side by side in full view. And the room reacted with a stillness that bordered on disbelief, because the image itself defied the structure they all understood, and Clara's breath caught, not in fear, not entirely, but in the weight of being seen in a way that had no precedent. And then the Duke spoke, his voice calm, precise, carrying without effort. "You have arranged candidates," he said, and the words were directed outward, not to Clara, not to any single individual, but to the room itself, to the structure that had been built around him, and Lady Harrowmont inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement, though her expression remained controlled, guarded, and he continued, "You have presented them," he said, and the line of daughters stood a fraction straighter, their posture tightening as though responding to an unseen cue, and Clara felt the contrast more sharply now, the deliberate perfection of their placement, their preparation, their expectation. And then he shifted his gaze, not across them, not weighing them as had been anticipated, but returning unmistakably to her. And the change in direction carried through the room like a second fracture, sharper than the first, because it removed any remaining doubt about where his attention lay, and for a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The silence expanding, holding, and Clara felt it press against her, the weight of being chosen without understanding why. The absence of explanation creating a space that felt both open and precarious, and then, from somewhere near the edge of the room, a voice spoke, quieter than the others had been, but carrying nonetheless, "She is not one of them." And the words were not confrontational, not sharp, but they carried a truth that everyone present understood, and the Duke did not respond immediately, his gaze remaining steady, his posture unchanged, and then, slowly, he reached forward, his hand lifting once more, this time not to guide, not to steady, but to indicate, his fingers extending toward Clara in a gesture that was simple, unmistakable, and he said, "She is now." And the words settled into the room with a finality that redefined everything that had come before, not as a challenge, not as an argument, but as a decision already made. And Clara felt it, not as sound, but as a shift within herself, the line she had never crossed now gone entirely, replaced by something she did not yet understand. And the ballroom, for all its light and order, had never felt so uncertain, because the rules that had defined it had just been rewritten in a single quiet sentence. The sentence did not fade, it remained suspended in the air as though the room itself refused to let it settle, and Clara felt it reverberate through her in a way that was not sound but recognition, the kind that arrives without warning and refuses to leave, and for a moment that stretched beyond comfort, no one responded, no one moved, because the structure they had relied on had just been replaced by something that did not yet have rules, and Clara stood within it, her hands empty, her shoulders still, the absence of the tray more present than its weight had ever been, and beside her, Duke Alexander Whitmore did not shift, his posture unchanged, his presence steady in a way that made everything else feel less certain. And then the reaction began, not as a single motion, but as fractures, small and sharp. A woman near the front lowering her gaze too quickly, another adjusting her gloves with fingers that did not quite align, Lord Penhurst taking a step that was almost forward before redirecting it into stillness, and at the center of it, Lady Harrowmont's composure held, but it was no longer smooth. It had edges now, visible in the slight tightening of her jaw, in the precision with which she drew a breath before speaking. And when she did, her voice carried further than before, not louder, but sharper, refined into something that no longer disguised its intent. "On what basis," she said, each word placed carefully, "does she stand among them?" And the question did not seek clarification, it sought justification, a return to structure through explanation, and Clara felt it press against her, the demand for definition, for something that would place her back within the lines she had always known. And for a fraction of a second, she felt the absence of one, felt the uncertainty of standing in a position that had no name, no preparation, no instruction, and her fingers curled slightly at her sides. Not visibly, not enough to draw attention, but enough that she felt the motion, the grounding of it. And then the Duke moved, not toward Lady Harrowmont, not in confrontation, but with a small, deliberate shift that placed him half a step closer to Clara, the distance between them narrowing again, not shielding, not concealing, but aligning. And the gesture altered the space once more, subtle and absolute. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same controlled precision, but there was something beneath it now, something that did not require explanation because it did not acknowledge the need for one. "Because I require it," he said, and the words settled with a finality that left no space for argument. Not because they answered the question, but because they replaced it and the room reacted. The tension no longer contained, moving outward in quiet, contained disruptions, a murmur rising and falling, quickly suppressed, the faint shift of bodies adjusting to a reality they had not prepared for, and Clara felt it all without turning her head, without moving, because the center had already been defined, and stepping away from it would not undo what had been done, and yet the weight of it pressed inward, the awareness of being seen not as a servant, not as background, but as something undefined, something that carried consequence. And then Lady Harrowmont stepped forward again, closer this time, the distance no longer measured for politeness, but for presence. And she stopped just short of where Clara stood, her gaze steady, direct, and for the first time it landed fully on Clara, not passing through, not dismissing, but assessing, and Clara felt it. The difference in that attention, the recognition within it, and the resistance that followed. And then Lady Harrowmont spoke again, her tone unchanged, but the words carrying more weight now that they were directed not only at the Duke, but at the situation itself. "You asked the room to accept what it has not agreed to," she said, and the statement held, balanced between challenge and fact, and Clara felt it press against her again. The collective expectation of the room, the shared understanding that had been broken, and for a moment it seemed as though the space might fracture further, might demand resolution in a way that could not be contained. And then the Duke's hand moved, not toward Clara, not toward the room, but toward the space between them, his fingers lifting slightly, not pointing, not commanding, but indicating. And the gesture was small, almost nothing, and yet it drew the eye, redirected the attention, and he said, "The room will follow." And the certainty in his voice did not rise, did not assert itself through force, it simply existed, and the effect was immediate, the tension shifting, not resolving, but redirecting, because the statement did not seek agreement, it assumed it, and the room responded in the only way it could, through silence, through the absence of contradiction, through the recognition that the structure had already changed, whether or not it had been accepted. And Clara felt it then, fully, the weight of where she stood, not at the edge, not in the background, but at the center of something that had moved beyond her understanding. And her breath steadied, not because the tension had lessened, but because it had reached a point where it could no longer increase without breaking, and she lifted her gaze, just slightly, enough to meet the line of sight that had been placed upon her, and for the first time she did not lower it immediately, did not retreat from it, and the moment held, suspended, the entire ballroom caught within it, the light from the chandeliers reflecting in still surfaces, in unmoving glass, in eyes that no longer looked away, and nothing resolved, not yet. The tension remaining, the consequences unspoken, but the shift complete, undeniable, and Clara stood within it, no longer where she had begun, and no longer able to return. The silence did not collapse. It reshaped itself, softer at the edges but heavier at the center, and Clara felt it settle not around her, but beneath her, like a floor that had been replaced while she was still standing on it. And for a moment no one moved because movement would mean acknowledging what had already changed, and the Duke remained beside her, his presence no longer a disruption, but a fixed point, something the room now had to account for rather than correct. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first shift came. A lady near the front lowering her fan, not in dismissal but in acceptance. A gentleman straightening his posture not in preparation for objection, but in quiet alignment. And the change did not spread quickly. It moved in controlled increments, one person at a time, each deciding without speaking that resistance had no place to land, and Clara stood within it, her shoulders still, her hands at her sides, and the absence of the tray now felt less like exposure and more like space, unfamiliar, unsteady, but real. And she drew a breath that reached deeper than the ones before it, not because the tension had ended, but because it had shifted into something she could stand inside without collapsing, and beside her the Duke moved again, not with the precision of interruption, but with the quiet certainty of continuation, his hand lifting not to guide her this time, not to reposition, but to acknowledge, his fingers pausing just above her elbow before settling lightly against it. And the contact was brief, controlled, but it carried a different weight now, no longer an act of defiance against the room, but a confirmation of what had already been established. And he turned slightly, angling his body toward the center once more, and she felt the motion as an invitation rather than a command, and her feet responded before she could question it, a single step forward, measured, steady, her posture aligning with the space he had created, and the room watched. But the watching had changed. It was no longer sharp, no longer questioning. It was something quieter, more measured, as though each person present had already accepted the shift and was now observing its shape. And Lady Harrowmont did not speak again, her silence now deliberate, her gaze still but no longer pressing, and Lord Penhurst inclined his head slightly, not toward the Duke, not fully, but enough to mark the adjustment, and the line of daughters who had once stood with certainty now held themselves differently. Not diminished, but repositioned, their place no longer singular, no longer unquestioned. And Clara felt the difference in the air, the way it moved around her instead of against her, and the chandeliers above seemed to catch the light differently, no brighter, no dimmer, but steadier, as though the room had found a new balance. And the music, which had lingered uncertain at the edges, began again in full, not louder, but complete, the rhythm restoring itself without erasing what had happened, and the sound moved through the space, filling the gaps that silence had held. And Clara stood within it, her breath steady now, her gaze no longer fixed downward, but lifted just enough to see the room as it was, not as it had been. And the Duke released her arm, the contact ending with the same control with which it had begun. And yet the absence of it did not remove the connection. It left it intact in a way that did not require touch, and he stepped forward, one pace, then another, and she followed, not out of instinct, but because the path had already been set, and they moved together into the center of the ballroom, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a measured continuity that made the transition feel inevitable, and the space open to receive them, not resisting, not yielding, simply adjusting. And for a moment, as they came to a stop beneath the central chandelier, everything aligned, the light, the movement, the attention, and Clara felt it, not as triumph, not as relief, but as a quiet, undeniable shift in where she stood. And though the tension had softened, it had not disappeared. It lingered in the glances that still held a fraction too long, in the silence that followed certain movements, in the knowledge that what had been changed could not be undone. And she remained there, beside him, within the space he had chosen, her presence no longer questioned, but not yet understood. And the room, for all its restored rhythm, carried that difference forward, a subtle, persistent echo of the moment that had redefined it. The music carried them forward, not as a command, but as a current that had already decided their direction, and Clara felt it in the measured rise and fall of each note, in the way the floor beneath her feet seemed to guide rather than resist, and she moved with it, one step, then another, her posture steady. Her breath aligned with the rhythm that now filled the space where silence had once pressed too tightly. And beside her, the Duke remained close, not touching, not guiding, but present in a way that no longer required action to be understood. And the ballroom adjusted around them, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability, couples resuming their positions, conversations restarting in softened tones, the structure rebuilding itself without erasing what had been altered. And Clara became aware of the shift not only in where she stood, but in how she was seen. The glances that met her now no longer dismissing, no longer passing over but pausing, measuring, acknowledging in ways that felt unfamiliar and undeniable, and she did not lower her gaze. Not this time. Her eyes remaining level, her focus steady, and the change was subtle, almost imperceptible. And yet it held, and as the music swelled slightly, the Duke turned toward her, not abruptly, not with ceremony, but with the same controlled precision that had defined every movement he had made that evening, his hand lifting, pausing just for a fraction of a second between them, as though marking the boundary that had once existed and now did not, and then extending fully, palm open, offering. And the gesture was simple, expected even, and yet, within the context of everything that had come before, it carried a weight that made the room respond, the movement around them slowing, the attention shifting once more, not with shock, but with a quiet, collective awareness. And Clara looked at his hand, at the space between them, at the choice contained within that single, steady motion, and for a breath that stretched longer than it should have, she remained still, not out of hesitation, but because she understood what it meant, not just to take it, but to be seen taking it. And then she moved, her fingers lifting, her hand placing itself in his, with a control that mirrored his own. The contact firm, steady, and for a fraction of a second, everything seemed to still again. The music fading to the edge of perception, the light from the chandeliers catching in the space between their joined hands, reflecting in a way that held the moment suspended, and then the movement returned, and he drew her forward, not sharply, not forcefully, but with a measured continuity that brought her into the pattern of the dance. And she followed, her steps aligning with his, her body adjusting to the rhythm that had once belonged only to those who had been prepared for it. And the ballroom opened around them, not resisting, not questioning, but incorporating. And as they moved, the contrast that had once defined her began to dissolve, not because it had been erased, but because it had been redefined, placed within a new context that no longer excluded her. And the glances that followed them now carried something different. Not disbelief, not resistance, but recognition, the quiet acceptance of a change that had already taken hold. And Clara felt it with each step, the floor steady beneath her, the movement natural in a way that surprised her, and the Duke's hand remained firm, guiding without pressure, leading without force. And for a moment, as they turned beneath the light, the entire room seemed to align around them. The music, the motion, the attention, all converging into a single seamless flow. And then, as the turn completed, as the movement slowed just enough to mark the end of a phrase, he leaned slightly closer, not enough to draw notice from across the room, but enough that his voice, when it came, reached her, and no one else. "You were never meant to stand at the edge," he said, and the words were quiet, controlled, but they carried a clarity that settled deeper than anything spoken aloud that evening. And Clara felt them, not as instruction, not as explanation, but as something that had already been true, whether she had known it or not. And the realization moved through her slowly, not changing her position, but altering how she held it. And the music rose again, pulling them back into motion, the dance continuing, the room moving with it, and as they passed through the light once more, Clara's reflection caught in the polished surface of a mirrored column, just for a second, just long enough to see it, not the servant at the edge, not the figure moving unseen, but herself, standing within the center, aligned with the space, with the movement, with the attention that no longer passed her by, and then the reflection slipped away, replaced by the flow of the dance, and the moment carried forward, not ending, not resolving entirely, but settling into something that would continue beyond this night.